let me make a couple of prefatory remarks, and then we're going to debut half of a piece. That is, we have two of the four voices, but we thought that the two voices will give you a sense of something that's a revolutionary process which is underway, which is to recapture the compositional method that was the musical revolution of the collaboration of Joseph Haydn and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Now, what we're going to be looking at is this question of how you communicate a musical idea, and this question of voicing. So when you hear all four voices, you'll see something that is different, because the addition of two voices is not just two different additional music notes per beat or something of that sort, but it's a question of how you increase the density of ideas. And the whole purpose of LaRouche's including classical music in the curriculum is precisely this idea of mastering principles of communication. And the question of a musical idea is what we'll be looking at tonight. So this is the second one from book one, right? Yeah. It's book one of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was Bach's Revolution. This was 1722 or 23, I believe. About the same time he composed the Jesu. And it was part of a process of work that included his development of vocal music, and at the same time a revolution on the keyboard. Up to that point, the scale did not really allow the keyboard instruments to play in all 24 major and minor keys. And due to some developments with what's called well-tempering, which in the course of this work on the music manual you'll get to. But during the process of work on that, Bach developed a capability to compose in every single scale, with all the sharps and flats, major and minor, on the keyboard. And it was obviously done in conjunction with the work that he was doing on the human voice. Up to Bach's time, that time, the keyboard did not allow you to do that. You could get to maybe 3 sharps or 4 sharps, and then you'd start having inconsistencies and problems in the tuning. And so the development of well-tempering allowed that to occur. Now, one of the points Lynn keeps making is that music is not a physical process. Some people think this is music, a plucked string or a bowed string. And if you study this in a physics class, they'll tell you that by doing this, the horsehairs on the bow and the catgut on the string are creating vibrations that move through the air. And the vibrations hit your ear, and your ear starts moving in sympathy with the vibrations in the air, and that's what a note is. And so music is the stringing together of notes, which is a physical process. Now, that would tend to imply that music is a science of hearing, in part, which raises the interesting question: how is it that the greatest composer in history, by the time he began to reach his maturity, could no longer hear? Beethoven was incapable of hearing. He went deaf in his late 20s, and he tried to do all sorts of things to compensate for that. He had a piano built on legs, certain kind of wood, with legs that were just about this, 2 inches high, on the floor, so he could stick his head on the wooden floor to try and pick up the vibrations from the piano strings on the floor to get the sense of hearing, which of course he couldn't do. Now, it's clear that Beethoven heard more than any of us here, even though he was deaf. And so the question in music is not notes. It's the ability to present an idea between the notes. In a sense, what John Keats said when he said, "Heard melodies are sweet, those unheard are sweeter. When he's talking about the pipes on the Grecian urn, where you cannot, of course, hear anything, and yet you see the piper playing and leaving a note hanging in the air for all of history. So in working on this, one of the things that we decided a while ago was to take advantage of the fact that a few of us have moderate capability, and that's being generous. I'm basically doing it on a curve, an average curve. Mihua plays well, I'm moderate, so put us together, maybe below moderate. You put us together and you get a kind of a moderate duet. But the idea of taking quartet music and looking at what Mozart and Haydn were seeing. And so we decided to try what was the basis of the Mozart-Haydn revolution, going back to Bach, going to the Well-Tempered Clavier. And I issued a challenge to Mihua, and some of you remember this from a cadre school a while ago, to take a 3 or 4 voice fugue written by Bach and figure out the voices. That is, on a piano, you have 2 hands and 3 or 4 voices presented by those 2 hands. So how do you know how the voicing works? Can you separate it? Can you present it in such a way that you capture the idea of Bach? Mozart did 6 or 7 of these as studies from the Well-Tempered Clavier. And some of you may have heard them. They're very interesting. They're piano or clavier pieces written for a string quartet. So Mihua set about doing this for a soprano, tenor, alto, and bass voice. And what we're going to play tonight is the soprano voice, which will be Mihua, and I'll be playing the alto voice of the second of the fugues from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier. And then we'll discuss this principle a little bit more. Here we go. Later, Vu will play that on the piano for you. Now, what were you hearing? Who wants to say what you thought you were hearing when you were listening?
A dialogue between a soprano and alto voice.
A dialogue between a soprano and an alto? Okay, fair enough. What else? Two voices responding to each other? As what Maria was saying, a dialogue. Anyone else have a thought on what you were hearing? Notes changing direction. Well, there were notes that some were going up when others were going down. Is that what you mean? Yeah. And what effect does that have? Dissonance. It can be dissonant. There are some dissonances in there. That's right. Does everyone know what a dissonance is? It's when you hear something that is not harmonic, that doesn't have the two notes go against each other in a way that sort of clashes, that doesn't sound beautiful or harmonic. And often in Bach, and then later in Mozart and Beethoven, you find a great deal of dissonance, but there's a purpose to it. You had something, George?
Well, it sounded like when they were going in different directions, your guys' violins, there's like, even though there's like two distinct instruments being played, it would make like a third kind of sound.
Okay, you almost hear a third voice, is what you're saying. Okay. So people hear a lot of different things. Now, can you imagine hearing that on a piano and then hearing four voices in the piano? If after Michwa's had a chance to practice it a little bit, she'll play it for us. But it's very difficult, and on first go-around, to hear the extra voices. Now, what you're actually hearing and the dialogue that's going on, it was a dialogue between several different people. It was with Bach, with Mozart, because it was through listening to Mozart and playing some of Mozart's transpositions of Bach that the idea for this came up. And then it was, in addition to that, a dialogue with Bach, Mozart, and Michwa in her writing of that. And then a dialogue with your minds. Now, a musical idea is not something like, oh, what a lovely tree, or something which is stated in words. A musical idea, if it's a real idea, is always a metaphor. And a note or a word, while you cannot have a sentence without words, a word has no meaning in itself. Lynn made a funny comment here about the New York Times and their opposition to punctuation. He said, you can communicate words which people can copy, that is, words which people can copy, but not ideas. The New York Times does not communicate ideas. They have a sign up there. It says, we do not communicate ideas, we send you words. Now, people think the meaning of ideas is contained in a word. But not all words have one simple meaning. And words can be used to communicate different conceptions, depending on how they're used. But in particular, when a word is used as part of a metaphor, and does anyone want to give a definition of a metaphor? When you say something meaning something else, can you give an example?
I don't know. The sun was a
Railroad.
What?
Railroad.
Railroad? Okay, and how is that a metaphor?
It's a metaphor because the road by itself is not the tracks. The road is plain, just a way, a plain way.
All right, well, that one actually cuts a number of ways. You mean a rail is not a road, but...
No, railroad, I mean, a road is just a
Yeah.
plain, and
Yeah.
rail by itself, I think, means like iron or something, right?
Well, it's a band of iron,
That's a conjunction.
but that's a different kind of thing. I mean, there are a lot of different things you can do with language, like the concept of an oxymoron. Jumbo shrimp, for example. Or under Rumsfeld, you can talk about military intelligence as an oxymoron. But a metaphor, Kim started to get at it. The question in metaphor is that you actually present an idea that's not contained in the words. That's what Ilya's getting at. That you're presenting something which creates in the mind of another an idea as opposed to a stringing together of a few words. Now, in music, as Lynn insists, music is not notes or a succession of notes, or even counterpoint is not, the official classroom definition of counterpoint is notes played against each other, right? Isn't that basically what they say? Now, you could do a chord. Is that counterpoint? Well, for modern scholastic practice, that's good enough. Now, the actual principle of counterpoint is musical metaphor. It's the way in which, ironically, notes are placed against each other in a direction which could be ascending, descending. It could be in chordal relations. Very often in good music, it's in relations that include dissonances and working out of dissonances. And one of the building blocks for that, as we know from the work that Mindy did with the Ave Verum, is the Lydian interval. A dissonance, when you hear it by itself, could you just play a Lydian on the piano, please? That's a Lydian interval. It sounds a little mysterious, but you wouldn't want a whole piece just written by those two. If you play them together, it sounds a little jarring. But the Lydian interval itself always has a direction to it. And you can almost hear, when you hear those two notes, you can almost hear the next note. Do-da-dum. It's a lead, it's leading somewhere. Because the nature of the Lydian is that it represents a boundary condition within a scale. That is, it's not something that's set. And the Lydian used to freak people out. When it was first introduced by Bach into regular church music, there were people who called it the devil's interval, because it didn't just flow in a simple harmonic pathway. So the question of ideas in music, what you're dealing with is the communication of something to another mind, which cannot be expressed in words, and which cannot be expressed simply by listening to a collection of notes. Now, one of the problems we have is that we're all taught in simple harmonies. You listen to music that actually has a tune to it. Now, most music today doesn't even have a tune to it. But if you listen to music with a tune to it, like, I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. You're hearing a succession of notes, and immediately, if you grew up in the 80s, you think Coca-Cola. Now, and somehow you're supposed to get a good feeling that if you drink Coca-Cola, if you're white, you'll hang out with black guys and have a lot of fun. And that's the commercial is all different races up on a hillside, drinking Coca-Cola and just getting down. But the idea of presenting something that goes beyond a simple pairwise relationship. A pairwise relationship, for example, if you just hear something like, those are four notes that when they're played together sound all right. If you put in the, you start to hear something that is a change. Now, is that change arbitrary, or does it represent a shift into something else? And that's where the Lydian represents something that's unique. It gives you a shift in your mind. You're already hearing something that's not there. The end of the second movement of the 387 that we play has this in the trio. There's the Lydian. So, does that sound good? What is the heat getting to you? I mean, basically what you're hearing when you now if I were just to play the first part of the first one of those chords, do you hear the second one? What begins to happen is that you are led toward an anticipation of a completion of an idea. And there's something in between those two chords, those two sets of notes, which is actually being anticipated in your mind. Now, this is what Mozart and Haydn discovered in Bach, in a musical dialogue. They listened to Bach. They worked on Bach. To really learn music doesn't mean you just learn to sing your part, and you learn to sing your part perfectly. All of you who have done choral singing have had this experience. You have a sectional, and you work like hell, with the piano to make sure every note is perfect. So at the end of a sectional, you walk out of there saying, "We nailed it. That was really good." So then you go into the full chorus, and you're confident, "We're going to nail it." And the first time, if you're a soprano or a tenor, and all of a sudden the baritone line comes in, you're not so sure. And even if you sing it perfectly, in perfect pitch, it might not be right. Now, why is that? That's part of the nature of the intervallic relationships, the intervals in music. And Lynn has made this comment many times that, the first probably 50 times I heard it, I thought, well, it's interesting, but I'm not really sure what he's saying. And this was part of the flaw in the way I approached Lynn. I would hear something, I might even repeat it, but I wasn't totally clear what he meant. Now, what does Lynn mean when he says you lessen or darken a note in a choral piece, in the Jesu, for example? What does he mean? See, you've read it all these times. You've sung it. You don't know?
What's part of the intonation?
Part of the intonation. What part? What does lessening or darkening mean? It's lowering just a bit so that you're not hitting the exact note that you would hit if you were playing the piano for that. There are many interesting instances. We're working on, we just started playing, I think it's the 421, the second of the Haydn quartets. And there's one part where the second violin is playing a G flat. Now, all you music aficionados, what's the relationship of a G flat and an F sharp? Same note? Same note? Mm-hmm. Well, and you have the second violin is playing this for about 8 measures. See, one of the things about the second violin, I'll wait for Miwa to come back to hear this. One of the things about the second violin is that you do a lot of that. The first violin's prancing through the stratosphere, and the second violin's sitting there playing something like that. But after 8 measures of G flat, all of a sudden it says F sharp. So I was just saying that, I was just commenting on the second violin, the role of the second violin. We often play many measures of just something like this while you're cavorting in the upper registers. But all of a sudden, G flat, and then it's written F sharp. And I was thinking, well, that's the same note. And so I just moved my second finger to where the third finger was. And I realized that it was supposed to be slightly lower because the note that's played in the first violin, for the intonation of the two to mesh, the F sharp and the G flat are not the same note. Now, what Lynn talks about in a quartet is that when you play a quartet, you have 4 people who are playing an instrument. Now, playing a stringed instrument is different than singing. You can actually hear the stringed instrument. You can hear the slight changes and shifts in intonation. You can hear when you're out of tune. Now, how many of you had the experience when you're singing for Briano, for example, and he hits something for you, and he says, no, you're sharp, and you're saying, wait a second, Briano must be losing his hearing. I hit that note perfectly. And he says, do it again. And you do it again, and he says, no, bring it down. Or, the perfect example is when you're singing in the shower and you think everything's beautiful. But with singing, you don't necessarily hear the way the voice sounds. And a choral conductor is necessary. When you start getting in larger groups, like for the Jesu, you need the conductor who at times will bring the note down. Now, I remember when we were working with Briano, one of the interesting examples of that was, I think it was between the bass and the alto. Was that the one where there's a Lydian, and the basses were nailing it when they were doing it alone. And then you put in the altos, and the basses were going sharp. And so they thought they were singing in tune. And John Segerson had you bring the note down a little bit. And so what you find in cross-voice relationships is that the question of intonation is the first thing you have to do. You have to hit the note. Now, Lynn said to be able to adjust a note, you have to be able to hit it. He said, I think to get to a village, you have to be in the village, or something like that. To be near the village, you have to be in the village. I'm not sure he's actually right on that, but anyway. The point he's making, it's in his comments to the Europeans. The point he was making is that working on the intonation is the first most important thing you do in singing or with the strings. But you can have perfect pitch in singing or on the strings, and you can play in perfect time. Perfect pitch and perfect time, and it'll sound like slop. It will sound mechanical. Because what you're actually looking for is those slight changes in intonation that enable you to navigate the well-tempered system. Because the well-tempered system is not an exact system. I think John Segerson described it as a system filled with transcendentals. Because you don't have an exact magnitude, or the magnitude that you may need in a simple scale or some more simple cross-voice relationship is changed as it becomes more dense, when there are more changes. And when you get to the late quartets of Beethoven, you hear notes that you didn't think existed. It's like looking at a palette of a painter and seeing a new color in there. And that, in fact, is exactly what Beethoven intended. Now, I was going to go through the relationship of Beethoven and Schiller, but I left my notes back in Houston. The one disadvantage that I have from doing this travel, besides not being in Houston very often and letting a lot of things slip by there, is that I have a huge library of notes that I've taken over 30 years, boxes of them. You've seen the room there, just boxes of notes, and they're in complete disarray. So I can't always find what I'm looking for. But I will say a couple of things about Beethoven from the standpoint of Beethoven's relationship to ideas and his conception of what he was doing with his music. There's a famous comment by a friend of his who, when he first heard one of the, not the last 3 or 4 quartets, but one of the later quartets, he just said, "Your friends don't know what you're doing anymore. We can't follow your music." And Beethoven wrote back to him, "I'm not writing for you, I'm writing for people in the future." And what had happened was that there was a mini dark age from Beethoven was born in one of the periods of greatest richness in music and culture. The period of the Weimar classical period, it's called. The period of the collaboration between Schiller and Goethe in Weimar, the great university town. And if you go, hopefully all of you will get a chance to visit Weimar once. I was there right after the wall came down, right after the collapse of East Germany, the event that Elia's parents mourn every year, the collapse of the communist regime in East Germany. And the one thing, I will say this, the one thing about the communists is they kept up Weimar really nicely. It's a beautiful little city. And on one corner was Schiller's house. It was a 2-story house, relatively simple, just nice, yellow front, a nice writing room, a study that looked out over the street. And if you looked catty corner, you saw this mansion on the other side of the street, which was Goethe's house. And Goethe lived in this big house, and when you walk in, first go in, and you see his sitting rooms, he has the Rape of Lucrece painted on one wall. He's got these huge pagan paintings. But as you go higher up toward his study, it gets more simple. And what was really quite moving is before you get to his study, he had a whole shelf of crystals. He's studying crystallography and minerals. And then you go into his study, and it's not so different from Schiller's. It looks out over a beautiful little garden. And there was a simple desk, and that's where Goethe did his writing. And Goethe and Schiller used to get together with Wilhelm von Humboldt and sit there and talk about how do you educate a population? How do you develop the capacity of a nation to advance? And at that same time that collaboration was going on, the young Beethoven was taking music lessons from the aging Joseph Haydn, not too far down the street in Vienna. And so you had in that little corner of the world some of the great thinkers of all history. And they were all built, they did their work built on the shoulders of Mozart, on the shoulders of Moses Mendelssohn and Gotthold Lessing, who in turn were students of the same Kästner, whose other student, Gauss, wrote the famous fundamental theorem of algebra in 1799, at which point Beethoven was giving concerts at the Imperial Palace in Vienna. So you had in that brief period of time this incredible diversity of intellect, of cultural development. And that's the environment in which Beethoven was developing. And then it was all shattered with the Napoleonic Wars. Now, at first, there were people who thought Napoleon was doing something good. But soon Napoleon's troops moved in on Vienna, and Beethoven was in Vienna when the city was put under siege. And he saw the troops of Napoleon march through the city, and he realized Napoleon was not a great liberator. And the battles to defeat the French included the development within the German army, the Prussian army, because there was no Germany then, the reading of Schiller's poems and plays. Wallenstein's Camp, one of the 3 parts of the Wallenstein trilogy, was actually performed around the campfires when the soldiers were preparing for battle. They didn't have iPods. They didn't have 50 Cent. They had Schiller. They were acting out the plays of Friedrich Schiller, and they were inspired to the point that ultimately it was the Prussian army that played a leading role in defeating the Napoleonic imperial forces. But unfortunately, instead of a new flowering of culture, Napoleon, who had been a British deployment from the beginning, was replaced by what was essentially a British dictatorship, using the Austrian Secret Service under Count Metternich, the famous villain of Austria, under the power of the Prussian army and the threat of the Russian army coming in. The British reorganized Europe. And one aspect of this was the Treaty of Vienna in 1815. One aspect of it was they changed the tuning. They said, oh, the Tsar's army sounds so beautiful because they tune higher. Their brass sounds so inspiring. And so the idea of a tuning of instruments and voices at C at 256 was obliterated into an arbitrary decision to tune higher. And that actually was the law in most of Europe, or was done in most of Europe, until Giuseppe Verdi, the famous composer in Italy, the opera composer in Italy, became a member of the Italian Senate and passed a law which said that no opera company in the nation of Italy can tune at anything but C at 256. Now that was a good law. That's the kind of thing that legislatures should do. But in Beethoven's time, the Congress of Vienna outlawed Schiller. It wasn't the Congress of Vienna, it was actually the Carlsbad decrees 2 years later, because they said, these ideas, they're stirring up the youth. They're giving them ideas like the nobility of man. They're giving them ideas that they can govern themselves. They can establish nation states. These are heretical ideas. And so they suppressed them. They made it illegal to perform Schiller in Austria or Germany. And what happened? The population became stupid. The population became dumbed down. In fact, Beethoven himself was once commenting to a friend, and he said, you walk down the streets in Vienna today. These are my Viennese. They used to love my music. Now they love Rossini. Now, if you listen to Rossini compared to what came after the death of Brahms, he's not bad. But Rossini was a tunester. Rossini wrote for the popular audience. And so Beethoven had a period of time where he did very little composition. And he was this is the Beethoven you hear about, the guy who threw his food across the room, who told his guests to leave, who was considered a tempestuous figure. They say that if you hear the storm scene, supposedly in the Seventh Symphony, that this is Beethoven's inner romantic self raging at the heavens like some kind of thunderstorm. And if you read some of his notebooks, and by the way, over half of his notebooks were destroyed by Schindler, who was his secretary. Beethoven, because he couldn't hear, would have people write for him, and then he would write responses. It was called his Tagebuch, his daybook. And he had these 400 something of these, and 239 were destroyed.
Wow.
Who knows? Maybe Schindler was told to destroy them. Maybe he was just incompetent. Maybe Beethoven said things he didn't like Schindler is an ass. Schindler, get out of my house. Oh, there's another book into the fireplace. I don't know. I haven't studied it that much. But what you do see in Beethoven's notebooks is an impatience with the decline of the creative capability of the population, an anger at people becoming stupid. And what did Beethoven do? This was the second time in his life he went into a brief period of hibernation. Not really hibernation, but where he didn't compose as much. The first time was when he first decided that he was going deaf and wrote a letter to his brothers where he started out saying, I'm going to kill myself because I'm supposed to have hearing better than anyone and I can't hear anything. And later in the same letter, though, he said, yet I am here to bring beauty. God put me here to bring beauty to man, and I will fulfill that task. It's called the Heiligenstadt Testament. Now, 17 years later, with great art shut down in Vienna, Beethoven immersed himself in the works of Schiller. He had his nephew go purchase for him the new complete works of Schiller. He read Joan of Arc, and in one of his notes he said, like Johanna, I go into battle with my banner held high. He had quotes from Schiller, and this is where, if I had my notes, I could give you some of these quotes. I'm giving this pretty much off the cuff right now. But Beethoven wrote in one of them, I must be stronger than my fate, which is a virtual paraphrase from Schiller in On the Sublime, about how man must will himself to go beyond his destiny, that even if you face overwhelming odds, you still do what's right. And this is what was driving Beethoven in these crucial years that were pretty miserable in Europe, where you had a massacre of workers in England who were striking. The police went in and shot them down. You had a police state developing in Russia, which by 1825 was complete under Tsar Nicholas I. You had a completely insane government in France. You had a government in England that the United States had to adopt the Monroe Doctrine to keep the British from taking over South America. And in this period of time where all seemed lost, Beethoven worked on Schiller. And one of the things he worked on was a poem that he had worked on since he was a young man, the Ode to Joy. And in the last years of his life, when Beethoven was writing music that some of his friends said they didn't understand, Beethoven produced the Diabelli variations, the late quartets, the Missa Solemnis, some of the music which is the pinnacle of classical composition in Western culture. And among those were the choral symphony, the Ninth Symphony, where he did something revolutionary. Instead of four movements that were all instrumental, in the fourth movement, he put a choral piece. And the choral piece was done in such a way that the fourth movement was a clear recapitulation of each of the first three movements, so that by the time you got done with the piece, you had a sense that this was one piece from beginning to end, one idea. Now, was the idea in it, all men are brothers? Well, that's the language idea. But what is the actual idea, if you were to say there's an idea in that piece? How many of you know the Ninth Symphony? Know it fairly well. What's the main idea of which all men are brothers is a subordinate part?
That all men are made in the image of the Creator and have a certain creative quality.
Yeah, creativity. That's the nature of man, as proven, not just by this piece, but if you listen to the piece and you concentrate on the piece, you're changed because you've just been put into a dialogue with one of the greatest minds in history. And that's how you're supposed to listen to music. You know, my wife got me an MP3 player a week and a half ago. I have no idea how to use it. I'm going to ask Sky or someone to rig me up some tunes or something. I was thinking, what would Mozart have been able to do if he had an MP3 player? So anytime he wanted to, he could. Mozart didn't need it. Mozart walked around with that in his head. Think about and all of you know this from doing work. If you've done a Gauss marathon, you know it. If you've done work on the curvature paper, the conformal mapping paper, if you've worked on a Shakespeare or a Schiller play, these ideas start living in your mind. And what lives in your mind is more powerful than what you have on a computer, an MP3 player, or a DVD, high density, whatever it is, smell-o-vision hologram. And this is what we mean when we talk about music. We talk about the capability of generating a higher quality of thinking. That's the idea that's implicit in a great piece of classical music. And so often, you'll find that the great music is a dialogue with something that was done by a previous composer. One of the things we showed at the Cadre School is that in the Mozart Quartet, Kerschel 387, in the fourth movement, some Bach breaks out in a fugal passage, which is another one of the Well-Tempered Clavier. That's something that Mihua found and we demonstrated at the Cadre School. That the Mozart was in a conscious dialogue with Bach. Bach was alive in his mind. The fact that Mozart and Haydn got to play together was such a wonderful thing for all history. It's just a tragedy had Mozart lived another 10, 15 years so that Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven would have been able to jam on a Sunday afternoon. You know, who knows what would have come out of that? Like the Baron von Swieten collaboration at his salon of Mozart and Haydn and the other great musicians of that time. Imagine had Beethoven been brought in as part of that process. Now, there's one other point I want to make in terms of looking at this thing, which is I see we're doing some work here on machine tool principle. And one of the things that's misunderstood about this, the question that came up at the town meeting at the convention. How can someone who has to work in a factory be creative? Remember the question? Are we back in touch with that guy? Are we still talking to him? We should be. Huh? Okay. Well, someone should check with her. If no one's talking to him, we should be. Look, Lynn identified the problem this way. He talked about the N manifold. The N manifold representing the array of physical principles that are involved in physical production. And then he said that this is what you want to do in development of an economy is go from the N to the N plus 1 manifold, where you have introduced new physical principles that transform the geometry or if you were to map out production, you would have to move to a new manifold because you have a completely different array of physical principles that are utilized for the basis of production. Now, what takes you from the N to the N plus 1 manifold? Well, human society is not characterized by the advance of machines. The machines advance, technology advances, not because machines invent new machines. I've never seen a machine invent a machine. Have you? So the idea that this can take place in some kind of dark machine shop when humans leave, like I think there's actually one of the first Pixar films was as soon as the humans left, the machines went in and started building new machines. Doesn't happen that way. You have another aspect of principles of society which Lynn once called the M manifold. That is the array of cultural principles that are those which underlie the development of the machine. And you see that over here in classical humanist education. That if you look at this diagram, schema for the machine tool principle, as you're developing new machine tool designs, new and improved product designs, and then the relationship of that to infrastructure which allows for the increasing intensity of the physical production. This takes place parallel to the advance of cultural, the cultural aspects of society, because without that you'd never have valid new hypotheses. A valid hypothesis does not come from someone sitting under a tree and having an apple hit them on the head, as Nick presented not too long ago. There's no physical thing which in itself causes someone to get a new idea. And so it's the communication of ideas which is represented in the M manifold. And for society to advance, you have the same kind of process of development. So in a sense, this process looks like this. You have the N manifold over the M to the N plus 1 over the M plus 1. Now, this is where you see the biggest problem for our society today. We've actually gone to the M minus 1 manifold in terms of the ability to develop a labor force. Everything we knew previously from the Renaissance period that enabled us to develop a physical economy that could sustain 6 billion people, we've lost. Whether it's classical music, whether it's the principles of poetry and metaphor, competent presentation of ideas through drama, they're gone. They're lost. There was a deliberate break to transform our culture into a non-human culture. And so people often say, well, why do you say classical culture is better? How come what we're doing, isn't there advance? Sure, there's advance. Bach was not the end of classical musical composition. However, those people who stood on his shoulders started by utilizing what he knew. In other words, there's a continuity, a continuous line of human development that many of you who've worked on this extensively know goes back to the Egyptians and the work in spherics done by the Egyptians. And that it's been broken. That line of development has been broken in the past. That's why we have dark ages. If you destroy that continuity between the mastery of new ideas based on hypotheses that come from the previous period of civilization, or even if you do this, if you take people and turn them into babbling idiots, so you get people on television, they say, well, how do you feel about that home run? Well, Jesus was with me and, and that begins to characterize language. You listen to a politician. Now, I gave you the crude version of that. The sophisticated version is sophistry. That's where the word sophisticated comes from. You get a politician who stands up there and says nothing using $20 words. Well, the people have spoken in the past, and I've heard the people, and that's why I'm going to do what the people want, and the people can always count on me, and that's what I'll do. And people say, oh, he's with us. They can't even figure out the guy's an idiot. Or worse, maybe he's smart, but he thinks you're a bunch of idiots. And so you have a political class that can get away with this kind of discussion. When was the last time you heard a congressman using an example from Shakespeare or Schiller? They used to. Lincoln quoted Shakespeare all the time. You may have Bush quote the Bible. He probably misquotes it and misuses it. But how often do you hear people speak in some form of literate language which communicates an idea? There's a famous story about Lincoln when he was being sold out by his cabinet. And they were saying, this is in the June 1864, he looked like he was going to lose the election. So the courageous members of his cabinet said, Abe, you should step down. Let us nominate someone who might win. And Lincoln had a different idea. He got them in at a late-night cabinet session and read to them. I don't know if he had them read it with him. I think he just read to them Shakespeare's great play, Richard III. Now, Richard III, for Lincoln's cabinet, was a metaphor. What was the metaphor Lincoln was communicating? In the play, from the very beginning, you see Richard III as a villain. He tells you he's a villain. He says, I who was not born for sportive tricks, born with a hump, looking so bad that dogs howl at my shadow as I walk by them. He said, I was not made for times of peace. War is what I like. Therefore, plots hath I laid, conspiracies, and so on. And you find out in the first scene, he's preparing to have his older brother, the king, kill his middle brother to prepare his ascendance to the throne. So he's a bad guy from the beginning. And what do you see with every single one of his dukes and nobles? He says, I will grant you a title to the land if you do such and such, if you kill some. It's like the Sopranos in a sense. You whack this guy, you'll get the territory. And what do these guys do? Behind his back, they talk about how bad he is, and then they go do what he says. So Lincoln reads this to his cabinet. And what's the message? If you make a compromise, you destroy yourself. Now, I don't know whether they just got worn out and decided to stick with him or whether he convinced them. But they stayed with him. Grant and Sherman turned around the war, and the nation was saved. Could you imagine Bush using Shakespeare to make a point, other than maybe shaking a spear? So when you look at when you look at our society today, you see what happens when you break this process. When you fail to educate the children of a society in classical ideas with classical method. If you don't do that, you turn out people who become basically appendages to computers and other forms of digital technology. They're not human. They can navigate the internet, but they can't communicate an idea. The internet cannot communicate an idea. I know some of you think that's heretical. You cannot organize someone over the internet. Some of you have tried. Our friend Steve Rendon took on the whole Cult Awareness Network, American Family Foundation. He poured his heart out on these blab lines. These, what are they called? The blogs. No matter what he said, their answer was, well, that's a typical Larouchian answer. That proves you're in a cult. No matter what he said. Because a computer or a television or a movie screen is not a human process. It's created by humans, but it's not the same as having real humans communicating an idea to you. And so the purpose of working on the Jesu, the purpose of mastering these principles of music, of counterpoint, and in the right hands in drama. And I want to re-emphasize this point. Lynn has said that he is completely committed to the collaboration that the LIM has had here with Robert Beltran because he trusts Robert. He sees in Robert someone who has worked on mastering the classical method of theater. And any of you who saw his performance, the production he did in The Big Knife, knows what I'm talking about. You left that theater after seeing The Big Knife with a sense that you had just lived in history. And that's what drama does. So the idea of this metaphor, the n over m to the n plus 1 over the m plus 1, that metaphor communicates this principle of the continuity of creative ideas. And so when you hear the two voices out of the four, and we'll later work on this so we have all four voices, but the two voices out of the four, you're hearing a collaboration between myself and Mihua and Bach and Mozart. And it's a collaboration into which you are invited. Now, it's interesting, if you remember from just a couple days ago, Lynn had a discussion with the European executive. And in the later part of that discussion, Lynn was taking no prisoner. Let me just put it like that. And he was saying to people, you've sold out, you've lost your passion. And they basically said, no, we haven't. We're still doing what you want us to do. And Lynn said, no, you're not. Because passion is a quality, a human quality of taking ideas and developing them so they live in others. An organizer is someone who works on Gauss, works on mastering polyphony in the Jesu meine Freude. For what purpose? You can be a better singer in the chorus? So you can dazzle your friends by showing them how to double the cube? No, you work on these things because you're developing your capacity to develop others. And for that purpose, a geometric construction can work, but you cannot describe to someone a geometric construction. You cannot take the pentagram of Mirificum and say, well, first you connect point A to point B. Now, then you have to find Pentagon 3 and attach it over on this side. Now, you could have a do-it-yourself Platonic solids kit. I think they actually have produced them. But you don't know what the Platonic solids are after you've built them. What's a Platonic solid? It's this thing right here. What's its significance? Well, I bought the kit and I made it out of the kit. And there are only 5 of them, and, it's cool. But actually constructing a Platonic solid creates a new idea in your mind. And when you work with someone else so that they're able to construct a Platonic solid, then you've imparted to them a new idea which you cannot do through words alone. And that's why the point, that the emphasis Lynn makes so much on classical culture as something unique, uniquely human. And so that's basically what I wanted to cover. We can take some time for some questions. Yeah.
It's not related to Beethoven, but to Bach. I just wonder if you know how it came that he seemingly revolutionized the art of music or classical music, and I'm pretty sure it didn't grow out of a vacuum.
No, there was a music, there was singing. Bach, what became, he went to St. Thomas Kirche in Leipzig as the conductor, the Kapellmeister. And he was, I think, the 60th or the 120th, or I don't remember, maybe he was the 60th or something like that. They had started in the 12th century with the boys' chorus at the school. Now, the music had advanced. They had brought different ideas in singing, but Bach was the one who truly revolutionized the music. There were attempts to suppress Bach. The interesting thing that, if Bach were known everywhere, then perhaps this Mozart revolution wouldn't be so clear. But Bach was not very well known. The name was known, and a few of the pieces were known. The Bach family was known, and Mozart got to meet Johann Christian Bach in Britain. And I don't know if he met Carl Philipp Emanuel or not, but he was familiar with C.P.E. Bach's music, 2 of the sons of Bach. And when the British Bach died, because Johann Christian Bach moved to Great Britain, Mozart was truly saddened. He'd known him as a child, and then he knew his music. But it wasn't until Baron von Swieten came back from Berlin in 1781 or 82. He had been he'd been in the embassy. I think he was the ambassador for a while from the Austrian monarch Joseph II to Frederick the Great. He came back with the manuscripts of Bach. And so Mozart and Haydn sat down and played through the art of the fugue, the well-tempered clavier, and the musical offering. In fact, there's a famous story. Von Swieten, when he was the ambassador, wrote a letter to the interior minister of Austria, von Kaunitz, who was not a good man. And in the note, he's up, what's he doing? He's there to spy on them. The ambassador in those days occasionally would pass on messages, but also spy. So he wrote a note back about Frederick the Great telling him about Bach, and then singing the song that he gave to Bach, that Bach turned into the musical offering. Now, can you imagine Bush having an ambassador coming back and saying, I just got some great news. They're reviving Bach, and listen to this piece. It doesn't happen. So Bach had predecessors also. His family, there were a number of musicians in his family. He did not spring from the earth as something new and astonishing, but he worked his ass off. He was one of the hardest working musicians ever. Mozart worked like crazy. This image of him and Amadeus of swilling wine and screwing women while he's playing at the piano all night composing is a fraud. He stayed up all night composing. And this is what a composer does. This is what a scientist does. You take a problem and you work on it. Beethoven took nearly 30 years, 23 years, from the time he first discovered Schiller's An die Freude, the Ode to Joy, until he completed it in the fourth movement of the Ninth Symphony. But Bach had predecessors and people who worked with him, but he made his own revolution. Scott, did you have a question? Yeah, Derek.
Well, with Beethoven's got a lot of work he's done. So something like you were saying, the Ninth Symphony. This is a revolution in music. But with some of his other stuff, like some of these piano sonatas, are these up to par? Are they somehow less classical? I don't know.
Well, there's something that after some work is started on the music manual, one of the things that comes up is the volume 2 of the music manual, which we never did, and which was essentially the string repertoire. Now, one of the things, I should have said this earlier, one of the things that's unique about string instruments, it's also somewhat there with winds, but it's not there with brass instruments or even the piano, is that these string instruments can imitate the human voice. In fact, this is really something that's pretty dumb in itself. But with the human mind working on it, with an idea in a human mind transmitted through a bowing arm, and then the use of the fingers on the hand, you can make this sing. And there were, just as Mozart took some of the Bach fugues and put them in some of his quartets, Beethoven did the same thing, and there's one thing called the C minor series, or the C series, which starts with the Ricercar from the musical offering of Bach, and part of it is the Kerschel 475. It's called C minor fantasies. That's the title they usually give it, and then Kerschel 457, which is a piano sonata, and then Beethoven wrote a couple in the same tradition. Couple of piano sonatas. Now, if you listen to what Beethoven does with the piano, he does the same kind of thing with the piano that he does, almost the same thing that he does with the quartets. He creates multiple voices, multiple polyphonies, and does it on a dead instrument, on a keyboard. So you take a look at one of the great pieces he wrote toward the end of his life, which should be something that's studied in intelligence school if you go to school to be a spy. It's called the Diabelli Variations. And it starts with a stupid little simple tune. And it was a contest. Who can write the most good variations on this simple tune? And Beethoven wrote 33 variations. By the third variation, you don't even hear anything of the original tune. And yet you do. And so unraveling the thread through 33 variations it's a part of this principle of motiforum. So on a piano, a dead instrument, he forces your mind to constantly seek the initial 4 or 5 notes with 4 or 5 intervals. In the end of a piece that it's sort of like going from the cave society to the planetary university on Mars in one piece.
That's called the what?
The motiforum, which means the leading theme, the unity of a theme. The motiforum is the moving theme, but the principle is that there's one idea in a piece. And that's why you use dissonance, and that's why you use these various things that you hear with more than one voice, because you're testing the ability of that theme to be sustained over a piece of music that includes an increasing density of singularities and changes. It's very much like what you see Bruce do when he shows you conformal mapping, and you see these weird things that morph from spiders into checkerboards into Chinese checkerboards, and and then it comes back to a little orange. What you're looking at is changes in surfaces. It's the same thing in music. As you introduce new singularities, the densities of ideas are creating, in a sense, different maps. But what you have is a singular impetus for it, an invariant that underlies it. That's why Lynn talks about Beethoven having developed the Dirichlet principle before Dirichlet in the late symphonies, or the late quartets. So we're going to conclude this by playing this for you again. And see if you hear some of what we were just discussing.
Hey, Harley?
Yeah.
Quick, what is the difference between a fugue and a quartet?
A fugue is a form of counterpoint. A quartet is 4 instruments.
Oh, okay, so they could be like one and the same in certain circumstances.
A quartet can play a fugue.
Yeah.
A fugue can't be a quartet. Actually, a fugue can be written for quartets. I need to close the door. So we'll play this again for you. Again, this is a Bach piano fugue transcribed for 2 violins, viola and cello, or soprano, tenor, alto, and bass by Michwa. And some of you are going to actually, as we prepare an article for Fidelio, we're going to probably have a link to the LIM website, which will include the quartet as a string quartet and also as a sung quartet. Because the idea is to, what you can see, actually, I should have said this. If you can see this, you see that Michwa did the registration, the register shifts, the changes in register. And she's also done this for the piece as, this is just the first or the second violin part. She's done it with the 4 parts together, so if you study it, you can actually see how it is she chose which part goes to which line. And I think you're going to do a class on that.
On the 14th.
On the 14th, on Flag Day. Michwa will do a class on the ideas behind the piece. So here's, once again, 2 of the 4 parts. All right, so we got